Not every elf who opened their eyes beside the dark waters of Cuiviénen chose to follow the summons west. When Oromi, the hunter, found the first of the elder children beneath the stars they had not yet been given names for, and brought word of them to Valinor, and the Vala Ulmo's tidings reached the ears of the powers that there were thinking creatures abroad in the world long before they were expected. 3 kindreds answered the call to journey to the Blessed Realm. The Vanya went first, and most completely, and few of them ever looked back. The Noldor followed, hungrier for knowledge than for safety, and their hunger would shape everything that came after them, in ways the wide world is still recovering from. And the Teleri came last and slowest, the most numerous of the 3 kindreds, and the most reluctant to leave the waters they had woken beside, so that a part of them was always, in some manner, looking back over their shoulder at the land they had left.
But not all of even the Teleri completed that journey. Some, under a leader named Lenwë, turned aside from the long road west, somewhere in the wild country beyond the misty mountains, and would not be persuaded onward. They became the Nandor, the elves who refused, and their children scattered into the forests of Middle-earth in the deep ages before the sun and moon were made, living among the green wood and the running water, with none of the high learning of Valinor, and none of its sorrows either, only the older, simpler relationship between a people and the wild places that made them.
And further back than even this division, there were elves who never went with Orome at all. The Avari, they were named by those who left them, the unwilling, and they remained in the darkness of the world's first ages by their own choice, scattered into hiding from the very first stirrings of evil that moved against the newly wakened elder children, learning to live quietly in shadowed valleys and under root and stone in a world they trusted less than their departed kin trusted the bright country across the sea. This is the deep, half-forgotten root from which the wood elves of later ages grew. When the songs and the histories speak of Silvan elves, the people of Mirkwood, the lesser-known folk who filled the eaves of Lothlórien before its golden age, the wandering kindreds, the high elves of Valinor sometimes regarded with a faint and not always kind condescension, they speak of the descendants of those who stayed behind in the world's first darkness, or who turned aside before the crossing, kin to the high elves by blood and by tongue, but estranged from them by every choice that followed. They did not see the light of the 2 trees of Valinor. They did not learn the deep lore of the Valar at the feet of those who had shaped the world. What they kept instead was an intimacy with growing things, with starlight before the sun existed to dim it, with the long, patient rhythms of forest and river that no civilization built upon stone ever quite recaptures once it is lost. It was into the company of these sylvan folk that the great elves of the West would eventually come, in flight from catastrophes that had nothing to do with the quiet world the wood elves had built for themselves. And the meeting of those 2 kinds of elves, the high and the humble, the Calaquendi and the Morriquendi, the light-touched and the earth-rooted, is the seed from which Mirkwood and Lothlórien both eventually grew. In the kingdom of Doriath, in the deep ages of the First Age, before the world had been broken and remade by the wars that ended it, there lived a Sindarin lord named Celeborn, kinsman to Thingol the king, of the same ancient stock of Teleri, who had crossed the sea but lingered at its shore, enchanted by the song of Osse, until their leader Elwë vanished into the woods of Beleriand and never returned to the ships at all, lost for an age in the company of the Maya Melian, before he was found again and crowned king of a hidden realm.
Celeborn grew to manhood, if such a word may be used for one of his kind, within the deep and guarded halls of Menegroth, in a kingdom protected by a hedge of enchantment that no servant of the enemy could cross uninvited, a kingdom that believed itself for a very long time beyond the reach of the wars consuming the rest of Beleriand.
Into that kingdom, in the early years of the First Age's long catastrophe, came the Noldor in their flight and their fury from Valinor. Among them, the granddaughter of the High King Finwë himself, a woman of the house of Finarfin, whose name was Galadriel. She had crossed the grinding ice of the far north on her own feet, in the company of her brothers, when the ships that might have carried them more easily were burned by her own kinsmen in a fit of pride and grief that the songs of later ages would call one of the great original wrongs of the elder days. She did not speak often in later years of that crossing, of the cold that reached into bone, of the ice that groaned and split beneath the feet of a host that had nowhere else to walk.
What the lore preserves of her in that age is simpler and more arresting, that she was, by the account of those who knew the whole of the house of Finwë, the most beautiful of all that great line, taller than most of her own people, with hair that held a light no other elf of the Noldor had ever carried, a deep and burning gold, inherited through her mother's kin from the Vanyar, said to have caught and kept something of the light of the two trees of Valinor itself, so that even in the deep places of Middle-earth, where no such light had ever fallen, her hair seemed to hold a private, internal radiance that drew the eye and did not let it go easily. Fëanor, her kinsman, asked her 3 times across the long years of their acquaintance for a single strand of that hair, wanting it for some working of craft that only he could have explained, and 3 times she refused him, not from spite, the accounts suggest, but from the particular wariness that the wisest of the Noldor in Middle-earth had already learned to feel around Fëanor's hungers, the sense that what he wanted to make from a thing he was given was rarely as simple as the asking made it sound. She had ambitions of her own, distinct from her cousin's wars and their long account settling with the kinslaying that had stained their crossing. She desired, the law says plainly, a realm and a people of her own to govern, not out of mere vanity, but out of the same restless, capable hunger for making and ordering that ran through much of her kindred, tempered in her case by a wisdom that several of her male relatives conspicuously lacked. She found Celeborn in Doriath, and what grew between them there, in the guarded twilight of Melian's kingdom, became the central partnership of both their long lives. 2 survivors of 2 different griefs, the high and the deep, the Noldor exile and the Sindarin prince, learning from each other across centuries what neither alone could have known. She remained in Middle-earth when the First Age ended, and the Valar at last sent their great host against Morgoth and broke his power and ended the long war. Pardon was offered to the Noldor, who had rebelled and crossed the sea against the will of the Valar. Most of those who survived took it gladly, weary beyond telling of a continent that had cost them everything they had brought to it. Galadriel did not take it. Whether from the lingering weight of the doom that had been spoken over her kindred at the start of their exile, or from her own unbroken desire to govern something of her own making in the world she had crossed an ocean of ice to reach, she stayed, and the staying would cost her 3 more ages of grief and labor before any path home was open to her again. She and Celeborn dwelt for a time in Lindon, by the grey shores where Gil-galad held the last great kingdom of the Noldor in Middle-earth, and afterward they came to Eregion in the years when that land flowered into the greatest centre of craft the Second Age would ever produce. The Gwaith y Myrdain, the smiths of Celebrimbor, working in fellowship with a stranger of fair seeming and deep knowledge, who called himself Annatar. Galadriel mistrusted him from the first meeting, as did Gil-galad, and history would prove the mistrust earned 100 times over before the rings he helped forge there finished doing what he had built them to do. When Eregion fell, broken by the armies Sauron unleashed once his rings had done their work, and his patience for collaboration had ended, 2 refuges rose from its ruin, and the elves who built them carried the wound of that fall with them for the remainder of the Second Age and beyond. Elrond led one company east and founded a hidden valley in the foothills below the Misty Mountains, a sanctuary that would in time be called Imladris by the elves and Rivendell by the speech of later men, the last homely house, as travellers of a much later age would come to know it, a place that for 3,000 years offered exactly what its name promised to anyone who reached it in sufficient need. Elrond himself carried a heritage stranger than almost any other living thing in Middle-earth. He was the son of Eärendam, the mariner, and Elwing, born of the union between a line descended from men and a line descended from elves, and, through his mother, from the Maya Melian herself. The same compounded inheritance that had been given a generation later to his own brother Elros, who chose mortality and founded Númenor, while Elrond chose the path of the elves, and so remained across all the ages that followed, ageless in a way his brother's entire civilization never could be. His face, in every account that describes it across the centuries of his long life, is the face neither young nor old, that belongs to no single moment in time, wise rather than aged, kind rather than merely venerable, a countenance that travellers meeting him for the first time consistently found both immediately trustworthy and impossible to place within any ordinary measures of years. He was a healer before he was anything else, and a keeper of law second to that, and the valley he raised in the wilderness reflected both, a house of books and remedies and quiet hospitality, built to withstand siege when siege came, for Sauron's armies did come in the years immediately following Eregion's fall, hunting the refugees and the law they had carried out with them, and Rivendell held against that hunting until Gil-galad's forces and an unlooked-for host out of the east broke the siege and drove the enemy back toward Mordor, but built, in every year that siege was not actively underway, for the gentler purpose of being a place where the weary could rest. He received, in time, one of the 3 rings that Celebrimbor had made apart from Sauron's corrupting hand, and given to those he most trusted to bear them honestly. Vilya, the Ring of Air, the mightiest of the 3, which Gil-galad held until his death at the end of the Second Age, and which passed, by the dying king's own wish, into Elrond's keeping for the remainder of the age that followed. Galadriel and Celeborn went a different way from Eregion's fall, south and east, into the great forest that lay along the river Anduin, where sylvan elves of the older, humbler stock had dwelt since long before either of them was born, in a land that would in time be called Lothlórien, the Dream Flower, the land of the Golden Wood.
A people of their own already lived there. They had not built halls of stone or towers of carved white rock. They had built their lives instead in the branches of trees, so vast and so strange that no other forest east of the Sundering Sea grew anything quite like them. Mullein trees, with bark of pale silver grey, and leaves that turned to gold in autumn and did not fall, holding their colour through the whole of winter until new leaves pushed the old ones gently free in spring, so that the wood beneath them was never bare and never brown, only ever some shade of gold or gold, world without end.
The Silvan folk built their dwellings in flets among those impossible boughs, rope and wood platforms reached by ladders that climbed the silver trunks into a canopy that filtered sunlight into something that did not feel quite like ordinary daylight anymore by the time it reached the forest floor. 2 lords already governed there when Galadriel and Celeborn arrived, Amdir, and eventually his son Amroth after him. And for a long while, the partnership between the high elves who came from the ruin of Eregion and the woodland folk who had always lived among the Malorn was a partnership of guests and hosts, rather than rulers and subjects. Galadriel and Celeborn dwelling among the Silvan people, and adding their craft and their counsel to a realm they did not, in those early centuries, fully claim as their own to rule. That changed across the Second Age, in stages too gradual for any single account to mark a precise turning, until by the time the realm's name had settled into the form later ages would know it by, Lothlórien, Galadriel's hand was unmistakably the hand that shaped the land's deepest protections, and her power was unmistakably the power that kept it safe across centuries when very little else in Middle-earth could claim the same.
Celebrimbor, in the last years before Sauron's betrayal became open war, gave her one of the 3, Nenya, the Ring of Water, set with a single white stone that some who saw it likened to a star caught and bound in silver. Through that ring she wove a protection over the Golden Wood unlike anything that had stood in Middle-earth since the hidden kingdoms of the Elder Days. Not a physical wall, not a hedge of thorn, but a bending of perception itself, so that those who entered Lothlórien with ill intent found the land resistant to them in ways they could not quite name, the paths subtly wrong, the distances subtly stretched, the whole wood working quietly and persistently against any will that meant it harm.
Time itself seemed to move differently within its borders, the years passing more lightly over those who dwelt there than they passed over the world outside, and travellers who left Lothlórien after even a brief stay sometimes found, on returning to the wider world, that more time had passed in their absence than their own sense of the visit could account for. The Second Age ended in the great war against Sauron that the last alliance of elves and men fought to its bitter, costly conclusion. And that war took both of the Eastern Realm's protector kings in the same campaign, a parallel grief that would echo between Mirkwood and Lothlórien for the remainder of their long histories. Amdir, lord of the Silvan folk of Lothlórien, marched east with his warriors to join the great host at Dagorlad on the dreary plain before the gates of Mordor, and fell there with the greater part of his following, lost in a battle whose details belong more properly to the chronicle of that war's larger sweep than to the story of the wood he died defending. His son Amroth inherited a diminished people and a grief that the Golden Wood would carry quietly for the remainder of the age. And in the same campaign, leading a host of his own out of a different forest far to the north, an elf lord named Oropher fell as well. Oropher was Sindarin by blood, kin in spirit if not directly in lineage to the royal house of Doriath, and he had led a portion of the Sindar east in the years following the First Age's catastrophes, east across the misty mountains and into the vast forest that the elves of that era called simply Greenwood the Great, a wood so large it stretched for hundreds of miles north to south along the eastern foothills of the mountains, unbroken and ancient and full of light. Some among the wise have suggested that Oropher and those who followed him went east in part because they found themselves increasingly uncomfortable as a minority beneath the rule of the more numerous and more politically dominant Noldor in the kingdoms further west, a quieter, less dramatic motive than war or grief, but one consistent with everything the lore preserves of his temperament, which inclined towards simplicity and a wariness of foreign authority that would pass down almost unchanged into his son. He settled among Silvan folk already living in Greenwood, much as Galadriel and Celeborn would later settle among the Silvan folk of Lothlórien. And over the years, his Sindarin blood and his rule blended into the older woodland population, until the two peoples were, by the Third Age, scarcely distinguishable from one another in custom or in tongue. He built halls for his people, not in the trees, but beneath the earth, delved into a great cave system in the northeastern reaches of the forest, beside the forest river, a fortress modelled in spirit, if not in scale, on Menegroth, the underground city of Doriath that he or his closest counselors had known in their youth, with carved stone gates and long galleries and a great hall where firelight and feasting filled the dark, with something the forest above could never quite manage on its own. When the call came to join the last alliance against Sauron, Oropher led his own people to the war, and the account that has survived him is not a kind one, in at least one particular. He is said to have attacked too soon, 3 times, eager and unwilling to wait for the coordinated assault that Gil-galad's wider strategy called for, and his impatience cost his army terribly before the battle was done, and cost him his own life among them. His son Thranduil survived the slaughter and led the remnant of their people home, back across the mountains, to the halls his father had carved, to rule a diminished and grieving realm, in a wood that had not yet, in those years, earned the darker name it would carry by the time the story of a hobbit and a dragon brought outsiders through it again. Thranduil was tall, as nearly all his kindred were, with the particular bearing the lore consistently grants to elven royalty, not merely physical height, but the harder-to-name quality of presence that made rooms organize themselves around him without his needing to ask for it. He wore, in the seasons of his people's gladness, a crown,
not of gold or silver in the ordinary sense, but woven from the living things of his forest, red leaves and bright berries in the autumn months, and in the summer a crown set with pale gems, the colour of forest light. He loved feasting in the old way of his people, the long tables and the bright lanterns hung among the trees, the wine of Dorwinion brought in barrels up the river at considerable cost and considerable difficulty, because the wood elves of his halls had not lost, even underground, the love of bright company and good drink that had marked their kind since before either Sindar or Silvan thought to draw the distinction. He governed a forest that did not stay untroubled for long. Within a few centuries of the last alliance's bitter ending, a shadow began to gather in the southern reaches of Greenwood the Great, slow, patient, unannounced, the same kind of careful concealment Sauron had practiced before in ages past, settling first into a fortress on a hill called Dol Guldur, and spreading outward from there in a sickness that crept through the trees themselves. Spiders came, vast, malevolent things, their origin uncertain, but their effect undeniable, weaving their webs through stretches of the forest that travelers learned, generation by generation, to avoid. Game grew scarce or strange. Paths that had once been clear and well marked twisted and lost themselves. Thranduil withdrew his people further north, deeper into the parts of the wood the shadow had not yet reached, and the forest's name began, in the mouths of those who still had reason to travel through it, to change from the old Greenwood the Great into something darker. Mirkwood, the wood under the spreading shadow, a name that stuck because it had become, by slow and undeniable degrees, simply accurate. Thranduil's people held what they could hold, and fought what came against them, and grew increasingly wary of outsiders, in a way the songs of later visitors did not always treat kindly. The elves of his halls had reason for their suspicion, that those songs rarely bothered to credit, having watched their forest darken around them for centuries, with no power great enough among them to reverse it. It was into this darkening, watchful realm that a company of dwarves came, in the years when the dragon Smaug still slept on his hoard beneath the lonely mountain, travelling the forest road with a wizard and a hobbit, and a quarrel with Thranduil's keeple that ran back generations, to an old grievance over unpaid debts and unhonoured guest rights between the elves of the wood and the dwarves who had once dwelt in the mountain before the dragon came. Thranduil's folk captured them in the deep wood after spiders had already done their worst against the company, and held them as prisoners in the halls beneath the hill. Not from cruelty exactly, by the standard the elves themselves understood it, but from the same hard caution that 3 centuries of shadow and spider had taught an entire people to apply to strangers wandering armed and unexplained through their territory. The dwarves escaped down the forest river in barrels meant for empty wine casks returning to Lake Town, in an escape clever enough that it became, in time, one of the more retold episodes of that whole adventure, and Thranduil's halls, briefly embarrassed by the slip, returned to their long watch unchanged in any deeper sense. When the dragon Smaug fell at last, killed by the bowman bard of Esgaroth after burning the lake town that had given the company shelter, Thranduil marched his own army towards the lonely mountain, partly in answer to the suffering of the lakemen who were his neighbours, and partly, the accounts are honest enough to admit, in the old elvish hope of treasure that might be owed for old grievances. What followed was the Battle of Five Armies, fought in the shadow of the reclaimed mountain, when goblins and wargs descended on the gathered forces of elves, men, and dwarves, in numbers great enough that the old quarrel between those three peoples dissolved overnight into desperate alliance.
Thranduil fought in that battle and survived it, and in its long and costly aftermath, when Bard came into his rightful inheritance as the new lord of a rebuilt dale, the two leaders settled their people's old account with a gift rather than a continued grudge, a portion of the recovered treasure, including a...
Far to the south, in the same general years, Lothlórien's own line of rulers reached its own quiet, sorrowful turning point. Amroth, son of Amdir, had ruled the sylvan folk of the Golden Wood since his father's death at Dagorlad, and in time he loved a maiden of his people named Nimrodel, for whom one of the wood's clearest rivers was named. Though the songs that preserve their story are fragments now, the fuller account lost to the long erosion that even the most careful elvish memory eventually suffers.
What is preserved with more certainty is the ending. In the same season that disturbances out of the north, the awakening of an old terror in the depths of the dwarves' lost mansions of Khazad-dûm, the flight of Durin's folk in its wake, sent unrest spilling southward through the wild lands beyond Lórien's borders. Nimrodel fled south in fear, and Amroth went after her. And somewhere on the coast near the mouth of the Anduin, in a storm that wrecked the ship meant to carry them onward, Amroth was thrown into the sea reaching for her, and drowned. After that loss, Galadriel and Celeborn, who had dwelt in the Golden Wood as honoured guests and counsellors for centuries already, took up the rule of Lothlórien in full, no longer beside a Silvan lord of equal standing, but as its acknowledged sovereigns, and the realm that the remainder of the Third Age would know by that name became from that point forward unambiguously theirs.
Galadriel's power over the wood deepened in the centuries that followed, and so did her watchfulness over everything that moved in the wider world beyond its borders. She kept a mirror, a basin of silver filled with water poured from a ewer she alone was permitted to handle, that showed to those she allowed before it not always what they wished to see, but what was, or what had been, or what might yet come to pass if the paths of the world bent in certain directions rather than others. She did not use it lightly. The lore is careful to note that even she, wise as she was, could not always tell which of the three kinds of vision the mirror was showing her in any given moment, and that the seeing of unwelcome truths within it had cost more than one who looked into its surface, a measure of the peace they had carried in before they did.
Her daughter, Celebrían, born to her and Celeborn in the Golden Wood, grew to womanhood there, and in time was given in marriage to Elrond of Rivendell, a union that joined the two great elvish refuges of the eastern lands by blood as well by the older bonds of friendship and shared grief that had already connected them since Erigion's fall. Celebrían bore Elrond 3 children, twin sons, Elladan and Elrohir, who grew into warriors as skilled and as restless as any of their age, riding often with the rangers of the north against the wandering evils of Eriador, in a kinship of purpose that the Dunedain themselves came to value highly, and a daughter, Arwen, whose own long story belongs more properly to the chronicle of the line of Elendil than to this one, save to say that she was called, in the years of her full beauty, the fairest living being then walking beneath the sky of Middle-earth, the inheritor at one remove of the same starlit grace her grandmother, Galadriel, had carried out of Valinor at the dawn of the world's troubles.
Grief found Celebrían in the autumn of the year that the wise reckon as 2509 of the Third Age. Travelling from Rivendell towards her parents' wood, she was waylaid by orcs in the high passes of the Misty Mountains, taken, the accounts record without softening the matter, and tormented before her sons, riding in pursuit, found and freed her.
A poisoned wound she carried from that captivity would not fully heal, though Elrond's own great skill in the arts of healing was brought fully to bear upon it across the year that followed. What mended in body did not mend entirely in spirit, and in the year after her wounding, Celebrían took ship from the Grey Havens and sailed west into the same undying country that had not yet, by that point in the long account, opened its doors again to either of her parents.
Elrond did not sail with her. His own time had not yet come, and would not come for nearly 500 years more. The longest of all the partings the bright kindreds of Middle-earth were made to endure across that age. A husband and wife divided by an ocean and by the patient, unhurried clock that governed when an elf might finally go home.
Rivendell, through all the long centuries of the Third Age that followed, remained what it had always been built to be, a refuge in the wilderness, a hall of deep books and deeper counsel, a place where the wise of many peoples gathered when the matters at hand were too large for any single kindred to carry alone.
It was there, late in the Third Age, that the White Council met to weigh what should be done about the gathering shadow in Dol Guldur, Elrond among its members, alongside Galadriel from the Golden Wood, the wizard Saruman, who led their deliberations, and whose counsel, in hindsight, the council came to regret trusting as fully as it had, and Mithrandir, the grey wanderer most among them suspected correctly of the shadow's true nature, long before the rest were willing to act on the suspicion. It was Elrond's house that sheltered the long and difficult council, generations later, at which the fate of a small golden ring was finally laid bare before representatives of every free people still capable of fielding a fight against it, and from which a fellowship of 9 was sent out to carry that burden to the one place in the world it could be unmade.
What that fellowship did beyond Rivendell's borders belongs to other chronicles. What concerns the Golden Wood and the deep holes under the forest hill, in the last years before the ring's destruction, is what came against them while the bearer carried his burdens south, far beyond either realm's sight or reach. Sauron's strength, fully returned and openly declared at last from his rebuilt seat in Mordor, struck outward on every front in the final year of the war, and Lothlórien and Mirkwood, the 2 eastern strongholds that had stood watch over his old hiding place in Dol Guldur for the better part of 3,000 years, were not spared the reckoning.
3 times the forces gathered in and around Dol Guldur assaulted the Golden Wood. Galadriel and Celeborn held it across every assault. The power she had woven into the land across the long centuries, proving its worth at last in the manner it had always been intended for, not merely to conceal the wood's beauty from idle wandering eyes, but to make it, when the day came, very nearly impossible for an army with ill intent to successfully cross. The wood held. It was the one great stronghold of that final year of war that no enemy force ever managed to break.
In Mirkwood, the trial took a harder and more direct form. Armies out of Dol Guldur and out of the east struck at Thranduil's diminished northern realm, in what the histories call the Battle Under the Trees, a long and grinding fight fought beneath a canopy that had darkened by that point in the age into something genuinely menacing, in which Thranduil's people were driven back nearly to the very gates of their underground holes before the tide, with help arriving from beyond the forest's borders, finally turned against the attackers.
It was in the immediate aftermath of that battle when word reached the forest that the One Ring had gone into the fire at last, and Sauron's will had collapsed across every front simultaneously, that Celeborn led a host across the Anduin and joined what remained of Thranduil's forces in a final assault of their own. Not a defense this time, but a reckoning 3,000 years overdue. They threw down the walls of Dol Guldur.
They tore apart the dungeons where Thrain, father of Thorin Oakenshield, had been held and broken in an earlier age, and they cast down the dark tower that had cast its shadow over the whole forest for longer than either of the realms it threatened could comfortably remember the wood without it.
Galadriel herself came at last to stand on that ruined hill, and what power remained to her, for her own great strength was already, in those final months, beginning the slow withdrawal that the destruction of the ring would impose on every working of magic that the Third Age's great powers had relied upon, was spent in the cleansing of that ground, driving the last lingering taint of 3,000 years of occupation out of soil that had been Sauron's foothold in the east since before the line of kings in the north had even finished fracturing into its 3 quarreling pieces. The forest was renamed in that cleansing, Eryn Lasgalen, the wood of green leaves, the people who had survived its long darkening called it. Mirkwood no longer, because the thing that had made it Mirkwood was gone, thrown down with its own tower into rubble that the trees, in the slow, patient way of things that measure time differently than the kindreds who name them, would spend the following centuries quietly reclaiming.
The wood was divided in the peace that followed. The northern reaches, where Thranduil's halls had stood through every age of the Shadow's long siege, remained his to govern, and he governed them still when the Fourth Age began. His name and his realm both carried into the histories that the New Age kept. The southern reaches, around the cleared ruin of Dol Guldur itself, passed for a time into Celeborn's keeping, renamed East Lórien in the brief years he held it, though he did not hold it long, for what called him, by the time the war had ended and the long peace it purchased had finally settled over the eastern lands, was not a southern forest still smelling of its own scorched history, but the company of his own daughter's children in the valley where his daughter's husband still kept his ancient house. The fading that the wise of every kindred had long foreseen began in earnest in the years immediately following the Rim's destruction, and it did not spare the realms whose long defense had helped make that destruction possible. Galadriel's ban was lifted at last. The doom of Mandos, spoken over the rebellious Noldor at the dawn of the First Age, had held her from any homeward voyage for 3 full ages of the world. But when the hobbit Frodo Baggins
bearer of the ring on its long road south, had stood before her in the Golden Wood, and, in a moment of terrible and complete trust, offered the ring itself into her keeping. She had refused it. She had named aloud in that moment what she might have become had she taken it, a queen terrible and fair as the morning, beautiful as the storm, beloved and feared by all who looked upon her, and had set the temptation down unclaimed, the same hunger for dominion that had driven her own kindred to rebellion and exile, resolved at last, after 3,000 years, into something her ancient pride had never quite managed to choose before that hour. That refusal, the accounts make clear, was the deed that finally answered the ancient doom. When the ring went into the fire and the long war ended, the way west stood open to her for the first time since she had crossed the grinding ice as a young and furious exile from a kingdom she had not yet learned to want less than the world she meant to make us herself instead. She and Celeborn dwelt together a while longer in the Golden Wood, its power slowly diminishing now that the ring she had worn for the better part of 2 ages no longer drew its strength from a world still subject to the older magics. Then, in the autumn of the Third Age's final year, she came north to the Grey Havens with Elrond, and with the small, weary company that had carried the ring to its ending and survived to see what came after. Bilbo Baggins, who had once held the thing himself in idle ignorance of what it was, Frodo, who had carried it the whole bitter distance and would never, by his own quiet admission, be entirely whole again for the carrying, and Gandalf, whose long labour in Middle-earth had finally, at impossibly great cost, succeeded. She took ship there at last, after 3,000 years of exile, spent building something beautiful in a world that had never stopped being dangerous around her. And Elrond went with her, Vilya still upon his hand, leaving behind the valley he had raised out of Eregon's ruin nearly 3 full ages before, leaving behind a son-in-law crowned king in the south, and a daughter who had chosen, against every wisdom her grandmother's long story might have offered her, to remain. Celeborn did not sail that day. He remained behind in Middle-earth for some while yet, the histories say, dwelling for a time in Imladris with his grandsons Elladan and Elrohir, watching the Fourth Age settle into its early shape, the last of the great elf lords of the Second Age, still walking a world that had largely stopped needing what his kind had once provided it. He was, by every account that troubles to mention it, the longest lived of all the Eldar who had ever set foot in Middle-earth, the last to take the final road west, when at last, very late, weary at last of a world that had given him glory and grief in roughly equal and exhausting measure across more than 7,000 years, he too went down to the sea and did not come back from it. Thranduil's fate the lore does not record past the Fourth Age's opening years, and perhaps this too is its own kind of mercy, that some stories are permitted simply to continue, unwitnessed, rather than being made to end on the page for the comfort of those still listening. His son Legolas, who had walked the whole hard length of the war as one of the 9 companions sent from Rivendell, returned to his father's halls after the ring's destruction, with the grief of having watched a great deal die, and the friendship of a dwarf, once the deepest of all old insults his people could imagine bearing toward that race, riding beside him as proof that even the oldest grudges could, in the right hands and the right hour, be set down.
In time, the histories say, Legolas led some part of his father's people south into Ithilien to help renew lands that war had emptied and grief had left untended. And in the fullness of years that followed, after his friend Thimli's own death by some accounts, or after the death of the king he had served across that whole long war, he built a grey ship of his own and sailed it down the Anduin and out into the sea. The last departure of any of these three great realms whose names this account has carried, the final closing of a door that had stood open in one form or another since before the sun and moon were hung in the sky to mark the years that all of them, in the end, had been counting down without quite admitting it.
What remained in the long, quiet centuries after were the things that do not need an elf standing beside them to keep existing. A golden wood that grew a little less golden every spring after the power that had kept it so finally withdrew with the one who had woven it. A forest in the east that kept its new name, Greenleaves, long after the people who had renamed it in their relief had mostly gone the way of all the rest. A valley in the foothills of the mountains where the house Elrond built stood empty at last, its long hospitality folded quietly closed, its books and its healing herbs and its deep fires banked down to nothing, because there was no one left in residence who still needed them lit. The light those three realms had carried did not go out all at once. It went the way all such light goes, in every account the wise have left of it, gradually, generation by generation, the green dimming by degrees into the ordinary green of an ordinary forest, the gold settling into the gold of any autumn anywhere, until the particular and irreplaceable brightness that three peoples had carried out of ages no living thing remembers firsthand anymore, was simply, finally, gone from the world it had spent so very long trying to keep beautiful in spite of everything working against it.
Somewhere along the upper Anduin, where the river runs quiet between banks no Molnorn tree has shadowed for an age, the old maps still mark a wood by a name that no one living can quite explain anymore. In the hills below the misty mountains, a valley holds the shape of a house that is not there. The stones remember the foundation. The land does not forget so easily as the people who walked away from it.
And far to the north, under a hill that was once carved with gates and galleries by a king who carried his grief home from a war his father did not survive, the deep places are quiet now, in the particular way the deep places go quiet once the singing inside them has finally, after every age it could manage, stopped.